Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith. It's the podcast that takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about life, culture and politics, all through the prism of food, even brownies. Because this week I'm with the editor of Waitrose Magazine, Leah Hyslop, whose latest book, The Brownie Diaries, is oozing with the kind of stories and recipes you'd expect from someone whose job it is to endlessly pull ideas out of the bag.
Writing cookbooks and working on food magazines have a really nice intersection. Part of the challenge on food magazines and in cookbooks is it's always coming up with that new twist, that new thing that will inspire people yet be accessible.
I started by asking her in the week Jamie Oliver's cookbook challenge hit our screens. What makes a really good cookbook?
It's a big question. What makes a great cookbook? I mean, I'm a journalist by training. I didn't go to culinary school or anything like that. I'm a home cook, really. But I think what I am very interested in story. And I think what makes a good cookbook is essentially always story. It's always that hook. And I haven't watched the programme yet, but I imagine that might be a problem with some of the pitches. You know, I think they need to have something that you go, oh, that's a really, whether that's someone's, you know, background, their family recipes, or whether it's just a good little, you know, something like salt, fat, acid, heat, which just has that really good, you know, that good structure, that good way of looking at food. And I think cut through the noise, because I don't know about you, but, you know, social media, recipe websites, you know, we get food from so many angles now, constantly. We're deluged by it. And I think that's something that's quite nice about a cookbook. It's quite a discrete unit, isn't it? It's something you sit down with and
yeah.
It's curated. Same with magazines, actually. You know, it's a physical object limited by size, and love and care has gone into each and every one of them, which sometimes you don't feel when you're looking at the vast, you know, when you type in lemon drizzle cake into Google and get 6 million results.
When you were pitching it to the publisher, or maybe you didn't even need to, maybe they came to you and asked you to do one, what was the pitch?
I did pitch it. And I pitched it actually because, funnily enough, there hadn't really been a good modern book on brownies as far as I could see. A couple of ones on like tray bakes, that kind of thing. But surprisingly, for something that I think has sort of become the way the cupcake was, I feel, in kind of, you know, the late 90s, the brownies is sort of everywhere. And they didn't feel like there was a particularly modern book about them. Not in the UK at any rate. I suppose America has its own great brownie tradition, as they were the nation that invented it.
It is very modern. I mean, did you at that time have, you know, the brownie glass of stout? Did you have the cocktailed one? Did you have the incredibly beautiful Instagrammable ones? I mean, of course you did. Is that how you pitched it?
I didn't have all of them, but the subtitle is, you know, recipes for happy times, heartbreak and everything in between. So I pitched it really as brownies for every mood, really, every moment. And that's how I thought they were for me, really. I've always loved baking. I've always really loved brownies. And when I sort of looked back at life, I could sort of see, yes, that was the brownie I made when I broke up with that person and I was very sad. And this was during my Ottolenghi phase when I got a bit carried away. You know, it was full of sour cherries and, you know, and I like that about a brownie, that it's a blank canvas, actually. You know, it's chocolatey, of course, but you can do so much with it. You can take it in any which direction, you know, simple, fancy. And they're the kind of thing that, you know, work. And I sound a bit like Bridget Jones's mother here, saying you can wear this necklace to any occasion.
I was going to mention Bridget Jones. You did actually say...
I do sound like Bridget Jones. I often sound like Bridget Jones's mother.
Well, you sound like Bridget Jones, actually. And the book is very much Bridget Jones in many ways. You know, it's like, you know, I feel terrible. So. Let's eat cake. Or let's make cake.
Yeah, exactly. Brownies solve many problems. But yeah, it's, you know, it's something you can eat by yourself, or you can make it for a dinner party and, you know, fancy it up with some ice cream. You know, it's quite democratic, the brownie.
It is. And it's an interesting time to bring a book about brownies out. And you do call it the Brownie Diaries. It feels like we've all shared this kind of experience of a time in history. And this is what you did during your lockdown. I mean, you know, if a book is a sort of a test of the nation's mindset, what does your book say about how we're feeling? Is it that we need a treat, or is it that we don't care anymore, or we're suddenly all bakers?
Yes, I mean, I think I started writing that book, I think the contract came through just before lockdown, and it was a very strange thing to be doing during lockdown because, I mean, in some ways quite good because I had nothing else to do at the weekends or the evenings outside the day job. But I was also just making them in a vacuum. And that was very odd for me because usually when you write a cookbook or you work in a magazine and develop recipes, you get feedback. You know, you work in a test kitchen where people try your your The editor might wander down and say, oh, I don't really like that. And even if it's just you at home, you would give them to, you know, your neighbours, you know, your family. And there was none of that really. You know, it was quite odd. I was sort of developing 50 plus recipes for this thing in semi-isolation. My husband and I did put on quite a lot of weight. I think the Brownie Stone is still a work in progress to shave off.
Well, everybody says the same things. Of course, there have been so many books that have come out since lockdown, and everybody was finding it really hard to feed people. Claudia Roden famously, had her whole family out in the garden on socially distanced tables, getting them to taste all the recipes in Med. I mean, everybody came up with lots and lots of different ways of doing it, but sending out boxes for people to try.
Yes, we did drop a few around neighbours. I mean, I think I left some outside the pub one day because I felt very sad for the pub landlord and the landlady. So I thought, I'll just give them some brownies. But it was odd doing it in a vacuum. I got to this point, I remember being like, is this what a brownie is meant to taste like? Because usually I'd be going to sort of cafes and restaurants and, trying different... Is that what it's meant to taste like? I can't even remember anymore what a brownie's meant to... it was quite an odd little time looking back on it. I have to say, when I finished it, I didn't want to eat one for a good few months.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because brownies, I would say, are absolutely for friendships. My kids would bake them at 1 o'clock in the morning with all their mates over for a sleepover. I don't think I've ever made brownies on my own or for myself. They are always for other people, aren't they?
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? I suppose it's the nature of the tray bake, isn't it? It's a big thing that you make and you slice up. They are a connective force, I think.
Yeah.
For sure.
So let's have a little look at the book. You do go into quite a lot of pub quiz trivia, which I really love about this. And actually, I do have to write a pub quiz for about 2 months' time. So I'm going to put a lot of your facts in here. The history of the brownie, fantastic. Which of the stories do you love best about where the brownie name came from? Mildred Brown Schrumpf or the Catherine Hepburn story?
Oh, I love them all. I think my favourite one, actually, is probably the least likely one, which is there's sort of this apocryphal story that there was this housewife in middle America whenever it was, and she messed up her cake. She left out, I don't know what it was, the flour or something, and it was a bit of a disappointment, but then she served it anyway. Oh, it was a massive hit, It's that, I love that story because there's a lot of foods like that. Tart tatin's another one, that was an accident, There's lots of foods like wonderful foods in our history that were supposedly invented by error. And I like that because I think cooking is about learning a lot of the time, when we're not all perfect.
It is. It's about the failed cake, isn't it? It's collapsed and cracked and oozing. I mean, that's the whole joy of it, isn't it?
But, yeah, and still delicious, yes. Crucially, because you made it.
But you do say that science makes better cakes, and you say that you are not a scientist.
I'm not a scientist, though I have learned an awful lot about brownie science in the writing of the book. I can sort of tell you how much an egg weighs now, which I didn't always used to be able to do.
You're just basically teaching us how to make failed cakes, which is absolutely fine by me.
Yes, if you think about a Victoria sponge, because equal sugar, butter, flour and the rest of it. A brownie, you always have much more sugar, much more butter, not very much flour, so the proportions are all over the place, and that's why they're so sort of dense and fudgy.
Yeah, tell us about your first food moment. It's the ultimate fudgy brownie.
Yes, well, obviously there's the great war in brownie circles, which is, do you like cakey brownies or do you like fudgy brownies? I think both are okay, by the way. I'm not one of those people who's going to slap you down because you like cakey. My husband likes cakey, which was very shocking to me, but we got over it. But yeah, this was the first one I developed. For me, this is the sort of perfect brownie. Sort of blueprint, really, in the book. Very high quantity of chocolate, obviously. Cocoa powder as well as chocolate. Cocoa powder is sort of a bit of a secret weapon, I think, in the brownie. It adds a kind of slightly different chocolatiness to melted chocolate. So any recipe that's got that in is good if you like a really intense brownie. It's got an extra egg yolk in it. I do that in some of my brownies. So as well as just the normal amount of eggs, I add just one extra yolk, and that gives you a bit more richness. And then baked for, just about enough time that it stops completely wobbling, really.
How do you get that papery crust that sets the brownie amateurs from the pros?
That's an interesting little bit of science, actually. So the secret that I use is to beat the mixture, essentially, which is odd because a lot of recipes will tell you for brownies, don't add air. So, there's a lot of different opinions on these things. But if you beat the mixture, you can do this two ways. So you can either beat the eggs separately until they're lovely and frothy and then whisk them in, or you can do what I do, which is I make the whole mix because I'm a bit lazy. I like to do it all in one pan, and then I put my electric beaters in and just give it a really good, zhuzh. And it sort of creates this sort of like meringue-like layer that sort of rises to the top. That's my top tip if you want that sort of papery crust, is to get the electric beaters out.
There are a lot of top tips in this one. I mean, for people who do love making brownies, I mean, there are lots and lots of different ways to make brownies, but there are also lots of top tips. Give us 2 more of your top tips.
Oh, 2 more of my top tips. Salt is crucial. I think sometimes people feel a bit funny about putting salt in sweet stuff, but you don't need a lot, and it doesn't make them taste salty, really. It just kind of rounds out all the flavours. And for chocolate, I think salt and chocolate is an especially good thing. It just makes the chocolate feel even more intense. So I would say salt is a really good one. Putting them in the fridge is the other one, actually. Not everyone likes to do this, but especially if you feel you've underbaked it a little bit. You know, when they're so fudgy you can barely slice them and they're just collapsing, which, you know, happens. Put them in the fridge for a couple of hours. They will be much easier to slice. And they go sort of... They get a bit more of a fudgy consistency. It's very nice. So I quite often put them in the fridge.
Excellent. Top tips. Second food moment is your Sunday blondies. Now, here we are going off on a tangent with your brownie recipes. I mean, you know, we'll go into the cocktail in a minute for your third food moment, but go into the Sunday blondie. It's inspired by an apple crumble.
It is inspired by an apple crumble. So it's a blondie, so it's got white chocolate in, but it's also got little chunks of apple. It's got bird's custard powder in the mix, which is a great ingredient to use in cakes, by the way. And then a sort of crumbled topping. And I like this one. This has got sort of sentimental value for me, really. My mum used to work on Sundays when I was a kid, so Sundays were always a very boring day. You know, we didn't sort of do the whole, Sunday roast at lunchtime, pub, stately home, nice walk. We didn't really do that. We all just sort of hung about till my mum got back and then we had dinner. So the days when my mum didn't work and she made, you know, a lovely roast and apple crumble was her dessert were quite special, actually. So that's sort of how that one came about. And I still really value Sundays, you know. That slow pottering around the kitchen on a Sunday is a particular pleasure, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels fantastically sort of British as well. I'm just going back to that question about, you know, how do you sell a cookbook? I mean, of course, brownies are an American invention, but this does feel quite British. You've got a lot of British ingredients and a lot of British rituals as well in it, a lot of British habits. When you're going to your publisher and you're pitching it, do you pitch it as an international book or is it pretty much for the British market?
Interestingly, British primarily, but they've always got that eye on overseas territories. As you know, I can only talk for my publisher and my experience. But so this one, I think, is going to be published in America in April, which I think will be very interesting to see how that does there. My last book, I think, was published was called Made in London. It was a London cookbook, which was published in the UK. But they did also do a German edition, which is quite interesting, I suppose, for the same reason that we might buy a book about, cooking in Istanbul.
Yeah. Well, the Americans also really love to have an eye on British habits and behaviours.
Exactly. Yes, but if you do have an angle that will work overseas as well, I think that does add a little something to your proposal.
Yeah, so super British it up. Make it so British that the Americans will buy it. How likely is Instagram to be absolutely flooded with your most beautiful brownies? Give us one absolute killer Instagram favourite from your book.
Yes, it would have to be the suitably tiled, I think I've called it ready for Instagram brownie or something. It's interesting, isn't it? I think food always has to taste delicious, but increasingly in the world of food, it also has to look very good and look very good on social media, which is a whole new way of looking at recipe creation, I think, that, maybe we didn't have to do so much before. It's sort of rippled with pistachios and rose petals. So it's got a sort of pink and green sort of hue. And yeah, I think it's quite nice.
Your third food moment is the brownie mudslide cocktail. I mean, this is actually a part of... I do want to talk to you about your job as editor of the Waitrose Magazine. You're all about coming up with ideas. I mean, how much of this book is inspired by your daily job of just constantly mashing up ideas and pulling new stuff out of the bag?
Writing cookbooks and working on food magazines have a really nice intersection. I remember when I did my first one, I kind of thought, oh God, this might distract me, from the job a bit or something. And it really didn't. And actually, weirdly, some of the things, I often went into work and said things like, oh, when I was researching my cookbook at the weekend, actually, I ate this really good dish in this restaurant and we should do that. So the two have a kind of natural synergy. But yeah, it is, part of the challenge on food magazines and in cookbooks is always coming up with that new twist, that new thing that will inspire people, yet be accessible. I mean, the big cliche on food journalists, I think, is that around summer we start planning Christmas and we all sit there in a big room and everyone just looks at each other in despair and we say, what are we going to do this year? How can we possibly make it different? But not too different, because people sometimes don't want too different. Not for that turkey.
Except that the trends are always changing. And, you know, as editor of Waitrose, you are in a position of dealing with ethics. You know, Waitrose is probably the most ethical of supermarkets. It certainly brands itself that way with the Waitrose Foundation.
Yes.
So, you know, when you're writing about chocolate, for example, you do more pub quiz facts. Thank you very much. I'll nick those. You know, the scientists argue that milk chocolate's fat to sugar ratio is similar to breast milk. That's in. Chocolate is the only food that melts at around body temperature. That's in. But you also paint this picture of how hard the farmers have to harvest these rugby ball sized pods by hand,
Yes.
split them open to reveal 60 cacao beans, each wrapped in a fibrous white pulp. There's a lot of work to be done. You don't underline it, you don't put it in bold, you don't, you know, hammer us over the head with the ethics there. But for me, it's quite plain to see that you're saying that chocolate is a very valuable commodity and don't take it too lightly. When you're writing about these things, how do you strike that balance by giving us enough information to make us make good choices all the time, and being light enough to be able to communicate that well?
It is a challenge. I think we always try not to preach. I think we, both on Waitrose Food Magazine and, you know, writing for cookbooks, you're speaking to an intelligent audience generally. So we try not to preach. We just and we try and tell good stories. I think it comes back to what I was saying about stories. It's interesting people in the facts about, you know, the farming, how long it takes to harvest, you know, a cocoa bean or whatever it might be, you know, develop a new tomato variety. It's finding those little human details often actually that will really appeal to people. So it's a challenge, but it's something we really enjoy doing, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Do you find that fun, kind of keeping up with the trends, being a thought leader, making people think twice and change their minds about their behaviour?
I think it's a real privileged position to be in, to be working at magazines and books. You know, I often think things like food waste, you know, Waitrose obviously doing great strides in kind of the operational side of things. You know, they're figuring out how to, you know, use less fuel, how to make better packaging. But when you work on the magazine, you're kind of at the forefront of people in their homes. You know, that's your job there, to be like, to inspire them how to use that soggy cabbage head and going off banana. So it's a slightly different challenge for us. But it's a really good one. And we try and be fun. That's actually, often we discuss this at work, you know, the sustainability stuff is really important. But you don't want to be dry or preachy. You have to engage people. And
how engaged do you think people are now, as opposed to, say, pre-lockdown, let's say, you know, 2 years ago? Do you find the letters are different now? Are people expressing their feelings about sustainability differently now?
I think so. I mean, I think the Waitrose reader, just to give an example, or customer, has always been quite environmentally minded, actually. That's something that's come up for a long time when you survey them about what they care about. Things like sustainability, animal welfare, they come up quite highly. But it does seem to be more and more important to people. And our letters are actually a sort of fascinating window. We get a lot of them. You know, we had one the other day from a lady who loved jacket potatoes, but she lived by herself and she never wanted to turn the oven on and waste the energy on making a single jacket potato. But we ran, you know, this little recipe feature and we said, you know, you can cook, you know, 4 or 5 at a time and then reheat them. And this had never occurred to her before, but she was so pleased. Like, it's such a small thing, but, you know, it made a difference. And that's a really nice thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, the greatest thing about magazines is the pictures, isn't it? And constantly sort of inspiring people to cook with their eyes. And your fourth food moment is your illustrated cake. It's not even in the book.
No, I've gone off piste.
Yes, it's one of your proudest achievements for working at the magazine. Tell us about that.
Well, so when lockdown hit in 2020, you know, if you worked in a magazine, it was, I mean, obviously much worse to be working in some other lines of work, but it was quite tricky for a magazine because we, you know, photo shoots weren't happening. We were out of the office. So we couldn't use our lovely test kitchen where we usually test all the recipes to make them perfect. So we kind of had to put our heads together and think about, can we produce a magazine right now? And Waitrose were very keen to do it because, you know, they wanted something, you know, in this time of being stuck at home, magazines were quite inspiring, they were quite comforting, they were a very nice thing to have. So we sort of put our heads together and the team came up with the idea of doing a fully illustrated issue, which was very hard work, perhaps more hard work than I had actually realised when we were discussing it so enthusiastically. You know, food photography is hard too, but if you imagine illustrating every single recipe in a magazine, it's incredibly hard work. A lot of going backwards and forwards about, the shape of that pineapple leaf isn't quite right, or the chicken, it's a lot of work. But we did it. It came together. It had a beautiful illustrated cake on the front by the artist Charlie McKeesy. And we did a little competition inside where we raffled off all the artworks that were created for the magazine and gave the money to the Trussell Trust, which is a food bank charity Waitrose does a lot with. And we got such lovely reader feedback from it. People genuinely found it quite uplifting. So I was very proud of that. I think it was a good reaction to a really strange, stressful, horrible time for so many people.
Yeah, how wonderful. Are you back in the office now?
Just starting to drift back now, so it'll be very nice to go and try all the food again, as that's the thing I think we've missed most, being stuck at home, not trying the lovely the food in the test kitchen.
And how does it feel? I mean, it's almost like a reset, isn't it? So, coming back after all this time, new ideas, new trends, new thought leading. What's the most important thing to say to everybody looking for your leadership right now?
Well, I think at the moment we're kind of focused on, as we've discussed, I think sustainability, animal welfare. I think sort of threading those issues through the magazine more and more are what we're looking at primarily right now. But also we're kind of continually evolving and adjusting recipes to, whatever the normal is at the time. One of the things we've started doing quite recently is doing recipes for one, which sort of started in the pandemic a bit because we had a lot of single people trapped at home, but actually there are an awful lot of people who live by themselves as well. And I think the standard recipe format feeds four, even if you're a couple, it can be slightly annoying always having to halve your recipes.
Yeah. What about health? I'm just thinking about, one of the things that we really learnt about in lockdown is, how important it is to really feed ourselves well. If you are living in an endemic, which means forever, how important is it to weave really healthy recipes through our everyday experience?
Yeah, I mean, that's something on the magazine we are increasingly looking at. We do, we kind of have a good health logo that we put on a lot of recipes. Our weeknight recipes always have a certain number of those every month. But yes, I think the pandemic made us all look at food more closely in every aspect. Health was one of them. Also just enjoyment was another one. I think that's why kind of sales of things like barbecues went through the roof, and home smokers and whatever else it was, because I think every aspect of food we suddenly had time to think about.
Yeah, and now we're all bakers.
Yes, exactly. Now we all know how to do sourdough, so...
And brownies.
And brownies.
Thanks for listening. You can also find me on Food FM, the online radio station and global podcast platform which aims to change the world through food. Do get in touch on social media. I'm at Cooking the Books with Gilly Smith on Instagram and at Gilly Smith on Twitter. And do sign up for my newsletter at gillysmith.com to find out about the Cooking the Books Supper Club at my house. And I'll be back tomorrow with the first in a special bonus episode to kick off a series with the Andre Simon Awards, in which we'll meet the shortlisted authors for this year's prestigious prize.